under continual threat when we have a healthcare, quote-unquote, healthcare bill that would strip a lot of funding for birth control and for low-income women to access to reproductive services. And we're also living at a time where we have a man running the country who, to sadly remind everyone, told us all that he can grab us by the pussy and do anything he wants. So it's not a time for complacency. It's a time to come together to discuss films like this. So everyone, please help me welcome Dr. Helen Thompson.
But I'll get started. First, I just wanted to thank Mary Visconti for this opportunity, and for organizing this entire screening. So let's give Mary a hand. I'm really thrilled to be here, and I'm going to talk mostly about the novel, actually. So and sort of leave it open for. I know also that I'm sure a lot of you have read the novel. I'm just curious if you could raise your hand if you've read Atwood's Handmaid. Oh, excellent. So a lot of you. How many of you have seen the Hulu, the recent series? Awesome. Okay, so fewer, but still. So obviously that can all be part of the mix because there's a lot happening right now around Handmaid's Tale. So I'll just, since Mary introduced me, I won't say more about myself except to say that I teach a lecture class on second wave feminism, which is largely the U.S. 60s and 70s feminism, and I also teach a women's gender studies class on sci-fi, utopian, and dystopian fiction, which also includes Handmaid's Tale. So I teach it in both of those contexts. And I also went to Duke, as Mary noted, and as some of you may notice, this movie was filmed at Duke University's large parts, like the salvaging scene. So happy memories of graduate school. So. Let's see. I'm going to say a little bit about the book and sort of some generic issues about the book versus the film or the show. And my point is really not to sort of be nitpicky about the differences between the multiple adaptations, the film and the show versus the book, because they're really huge, but more to think about kind of what I would call generic differences between the book as a written text, which is really a very literary text, and the film, obviously, or the show as sort of visual media. So the main difference I just wanted to point out about the book, and those of you who have read it will immediately remember this, is that it's what's called a found manuscript, which is a kind of trope or a kind of conceit used in fiction since like the 1700s to imagine that the book is coming from like a pile of manuscript found somewhere in an old chest or like a bunch of letters, and then some editorial person puts it together and then presents it as a book. In other words, so that the text is actually a sort of found document that exists in the real world. And how many of you have seen the Blair Witch Project from 1999? So that is the trope of found, also the same trope, of course, but it's found footage. So the idea is that it allows the viewer or the reader to kind of conceive of the text as real. And of course, a lot of people do actually believe that the Blair Witch Project is real. So if you so Atwood sets this up. So The Handmaid's Tale is actually from the vantage of the end of the book, which is set in 2195. So in like a much more distant future, which is a much more progressive, kind of globally. It seems to be much more globally kind of egalitarian and happy future. There's actually a Galadian Studies Association meeting, so there's an academic conference being held in 2195, and we learned that The Handmaid's Tale, which is imposed, an imposed title, is meant to echo Chaucer's, Chaucer's medieval text, but in any case, it was 30 cassette tapes that were found in a trunk out of order, sort of just verbally recorded. So that's the sort of the found manuscript that Atwood sort of says that presents her novel as ultimately. And so the main thing for us just to remember in terms of the novel is that it's really just one woman narrating her fragmented experience, and that there's some Galadian studies person who found these cassettes, puts them in order and edits them and gives them a title. So in other words, they're kind of archival fragments that don't present a kind of schematic bird's eye view of Gilead. It's just a very kind of close up jumbled experience, and this narrator woman of Fred, her name in the book is June, not Kate, but whatever, it's sort of, doesn't actually know whatever happens to her husband. Like, we don't know, based on these fragmented experiences in the book, whether he's dead or alive, what happens to her daughter. So there's absolutely no closure provided in the book. It's just this kind of jumbled fragments that have been organized. Let's see, what else do I have to say about this? Okay, so I'm just going to point to a few selective things from the book that are brought out of the book sort of as a book. In other words, like what kind of questions it leaves us to think about, which are very, I think, a little bit different than the film. But I hope will sort of maybe allow us some jumping off points or allow us some sort of ways of some sort of contrast. So again, the book is very, very much based on this kind of internal experience of oppression. Like, we're getting the experience of June as a very confused, traumatized woman who's just been thrust into this regime. And what I think Atwood is really interested in is how living under an oppressive new regime, how we sort of normalize that, how we sort of internalize it and sort of inhabit it, and how it becomes sort of naturalized. And so the question I think her book raises, which is quite interesting, is not actually how much we resist, but how much we accept. And so that, I think, is a really live question for us today. Like, not necessarily how much we're out there resisting, but how much we actually normalize, absorb, accept on a day-to-day basis. And even today, the New York Times had a story about a woman in a menstrual hut in Nepal who died of a snake bite because she could not be given medical attention fast enough because she was in this menstrual hut. And certainly in Northern Ireland, I saw in the London Review of Books an appeal about women who get life in prison for having an abortion. So the question really, I think, is how much do we just live with, and what does that mean? How does that happen? So the present tense of Atwood's book is about 1988, and the book was actually published in 85. And so Gilead in the book, and that seems to be roughly the case here too, has been in place for only 3 years, so really not very long. And I just want to say, sort of the historical context of the book's appearance is the 1980s, like a really fun time. Reagan era, a sort of massive backlash against 70s second, and particularly against Roe versus Wade, the ascendancy of the moral majority, which was, of course, a church sort of morality movement, spearheaded by Jerry Falwell, and the Phyllis Schlafly, various kind of anti-feminist women who helped defeat the Equal Rights Amendment. So certainly Atwood is commenting on this 80s backlash, but she's also, from the other side, commenting on what were called the sex wars, which was sort of internal debate to feminism between sort of sex positive and porn positive feminists, and some other feminists, notably Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon, who were very anti-pornography and actually drafted legislation criminalizing pornography, which, and I think Atwood sees that as a highly cautionary situation in which a kind of censorious version of feminism can play into the hands of kind of religious right wing. And that's her opinion. But I think she, in the book at least, June's mother is a feminist, second-line feminist, and she helps participate, helps burn magazines. So the question I always discuss with my student is how quickly do you sort of relate, how do you relate to June's accommodation to her new reality? And what's really interesting about the book is that, and which cannot really be represented on the screen, is the fact that in the book it's enacted largely through language. So I just wanted to read you a couple really, really short passages Is that okay? Mary, just tell me if this gets too long. That sort of allow us to think about how Atwood is staging this as kind of a linguistic phenomenon. And Atwood herself is a very literary person, and those of you who read the Mad Adam trilogy, has also written a hugely amazing anti-dystopian, more recent dystopia, but always very concerned about language. So this is a kind of little, and of course it's not incidental that June was a librarian, her job, and she's in Cambridge. So the actual setting of the book is Cambridge, Massachusetts, and there's a strong intimation that she went to Harvard. And Moira in the book is her friend from college, and they write papers on date rape and joke about it being date rapé, like sounding like a good, some kind of salad. So there's an intimation that, she is linguistically very adept. So anyway, this is a scene where she's just walking with Of Glen, her shopping partner, as a handmaid. So she writes, Of Glen and I walk slowly today. We are hot in our long dresses, wet under the arms, tired. At least in this heat, we don't wear gloves. There used to be an ice cream store somewhere in this block. I can't remember the name. Things can change so quickly. Buildings can be torn down or turned into something else. It's hard to keep them straight in your mind the way they used to be. You could get double scoops, and if you wanted, they would put chocolate sprinkles on the top. These had the name of a man. Johnny's? Jackie's? I can't remember. We would go there when she was little, and I'd hold her up so she could see through the glass side of the counter where the vats of ice cream were on display, colored so delicately, pale orange, pale green, pale pink. And I'd read the names to her so she could choose. She wouldn't choose by the name, though, but by the color. Her dresses and overalls were those colors, too. Ice cream pastels. Jimmy's, that was the name. So the question I'll just quickly broach and then move to another passage is just, can you imagine yourselves in 3 years forgetting the word Jimmy's for those little sprinkles? And this is what Atwood, how she wants us to think in this very granular way about it being oppressed, what it means to be, which is both a function of violence, obviously, like violence and coercion, but also a function of sort of lack of access to language, since women aren't allowed to read in Gilead. And I think that one aspect that Atwood wants us to take very seriously is that memory itself is susceptible to external oppression. That, in other words, this character, June, she's not capable of remembering, that under a kind of certain amount of sort of external constraint or structural constraint, we would all sort of feel our sort of political capacities or our memories eroding. So I'm going to turn to just one other quick passage, which has a little bit of a game, and this is page 238. Sorry, that's what I would do in class. That's why I said page number. Unless you go buy this book, which I recommend. So this is the scene in Jezebels, which is the kind of converted Cambridge hotel, motel, whatever, which has now become a brothel for the commanders. And it's the moment where she sees Moira. And it interests me that neither the movie nor the book choose to follow this particular sort of costuming detail. And you can see that Atwood is really interested in language as a sort of medium of power, sort of access to language, access to memory, but also dress. I mean, clearly the handmaids are forced to wear these weird outfits, and it's kind of, everyone is, but already with the pastel ice cream and the pastel girls' clothes, there's a little bit of a hint around just how women, there might be certain continuities with 80s America, kind of pre-Gilead, and that has to do partly with clothing. So I'll just quickly read this scene too. Then I see her, Moira. She's standing with 2 other women over near the fountain. I have to look hard again to make sure it's her. I do this in pulses, quick flickers of the eyes, so no one will notice. She's dressed absurdly in a black outfit of once shiny satin that looks the worse for wear. It's strapless, wired from the inside, pushing up the breasts, but it doesn't quite fit Moira. It's too large, so that one breast is plumped out and the other one isn't. She's tugging absent-mindedly at the top, pulling it up. There's a wad of cotton attached to the back. I can see it as she half turns. It looks like a sanitary pad that's been popped like a piece of popcorn. I realize that it's supposed to be a tail. Attached to her head are 2 ears, of a rabbit or a deer. It's not easy to tell. One of the ears has lost its starch or wiring and is flopping halfway down. She has a black bow tie around her neck and is wearing black net stockings and black high heels. She always hated high heels. The whole costume, antique and bizarre, reminds me of something from the past, but I can't think what. A stage play? A musical comedy? Girls dressed for Easter in rabbit suits. What is the significance of it here? Why are rabbits supposed to be sexually attractive to men? How can this bedraggled costume appeal? So what is she dressed as? Playboy bunny. And so the kind of wonderful thing about this is she never remembers what that is. And so this whole kind of something that's immediately familiar to the reader is sort of defamiliarized through June's eyes, because she genuinely can't place what this is any longer, even though she's only been in Gilead for 3 years. So, I mean, the question then inevitably raised for us is simply, would we, perhaps as women, would we lose our memories so quickly? So I just want to say again that the book is constantly working over June's position, this very blurry edge of remembering and forgetting, and really stressing that memory is not really in her individual control. Like under censorship, under coercion, she may not be capable of remembering. And so the book is really, I think, not invested in individual heroics. In other words, it's not offering June as a really resistant heroine or sort of uniquely strong heroine at all. And those of you who read it know that she doesn't do anything heroic in the book, and she doesn't actually help Maura escape, as she does in both the Hulu series and the film. And I think this is a really key insight from second wave feminism, actually, which is that women can't defeat the patriarchy alone. That at least the insight or the sort of analytic framework that the second wave wants to offer is that women are oppressed as a class, as an entire group. So Atwood really is sort of suggesting that this kind of individual resistance just isn't really possible for her. And so the film, I think, as a visual medium, just really isn't able to offer us this kind of internal representation of what's happening sort of linguistically and just psychologically to June. And I think, of course, the Hulu series, those of you who've even seen any of it, you know that there's a voiceover, which goes some way, I think, in helping restore some of this, although there's very little intimation in the Hulu series of forgetting. That's not really represented. But the film, of course, doesn't even have that. And apparently there was, I think maybe Natasha Richardson did record some kind of voiceover, and then it was not used. So she's really she doesn't have a very profound psychology. So quickly, the other aspect I would just bring up is, and which is I think the most pressing for us, and Mary has already raised it, is just the question of continuities between Gilead and today, or Gilead and 1985, which is when the book was written. And the key aspect, I'm sure a lot of you know this about the book, for Atwood, and this was almost like a dare that she took, is that every aspect of Gilead in the book has really historically occurred. So she really wants to stress that these are all, and she's referencing American Puritanism and the killing of adulterous wives. She's referencing the Romanian regime from 1967 to 1990 when abortion was criminalized and there's sort of forced fertility. She's referencing the Philippines with the salvagings and the extrajudicial murder, which of course is still going on. So Atwood really does want to foreground the extent to which women's oppression is even now occluded or ignored and naturalized, whether in the US or in the world. Let's see, so anything else I want to say? So there's one other scene I want to read, and this is, again, to think about just the continuities between Gilead and what comes before. And I think the film represents Gilead as a really strong break from what came before, and Atwood, I think, offers us a little bit more ambivalent portrayal of that. And the other slogan from the second wave I would just bring up, the first one being that women are oppressed as a class, and but the second, which is maybe more famous, is that you probably heard, the personal is political. Which is perhaps the most famous slogan to come out of the second wave. And that does force a certain analysis of one's own domestic life. And Atwood does, including one's own domestic relationships. So this is coming from a scene. June is not a political thinker at all, but when she's fired, women are all fired together on the same day, so that their bank accounts are frozen, they're fired, they lose any financial autonomy, and the airports are kind of shut down. So that's sort of how Gilead is instituted. And so she's fired, she comes home, and then she has the following scene with her husband. And then this is it, then I'm done. So she says, and this is a fragment of her narrative. That night after I'd lost my job, Luke wanted to make love. This is her husband. Luke wanted to make love. Why didn't I want to? Desperation alone should have driven me, but I still felt numbed. I could hardly even feel his hands on me. What's the matter, he said. I don't know, I said. We still have, he said, but he didn't go on to say what we still had. It occurred to me that he shouldn't be saying we, since nothing that I knew of had been taken away from him. We still have each other, I said. It was true. Then why did I sound, even to myself, so indifferent? He kissed me then, as if now I'd said that, things could get back to normal. But something had shifted, some balance. I felt shrunken, so that when he put his arms around me, gathering me up, I was as small as a doll. I felt love going forward without me. He doesn't mind this, I thought. He doesn't mind it at all. Maybe he even likes it. We are not each other's anymore. Instead, I am his. Unworthy, unjust, untrue. But this is what happened. So Luke, what I want to ask you now, what I need to know is, was I right? Because we never talked about it. By the time I could have done that, I was afraid to. I couldn't afford to lose you. So that's powerful and clearly speaking to a certain imbalance of power that is happening actively with the sort of inception of Gilead, but perhaps also speaking just however elusively to questions of marital sex and power and consent, which clearly we see in the ceremony in Gilead, a far less equivocal representation of intercourse, although in fact the book is very careful. June herself is very careful to say, I actually did have a choice. I could have been sent to the colonies, so I'm not going to call this rape. Clearly, the film wants to represent it more vividly as rape, as does the series. But I think Atwood really does want to suggest with this marriage scene with Luke, even before Gilead, even before she becomes the property of the commander, that there are sort of complicated ambivalences around power and sex in marriage. So I'll leave us there with this question of sort of continuities that perhaps we could think about, as well as clearly really massive discontinuities. And of course, the film has its own really rich visual vocabulary, and so we can talk all about that. So thank you.
Gilead, is that a biblical reference or?
Yes. I know yes, but I don't have a lot more. So anyone who has a better answer than yes, please. I don't. Yeah. Right. Yes.
When you were talking about altering memory and language, and then I was thinking that perhaps if the book came out in '85, it was being worked on in '84 or anticipation of 1984.
Yes.
And it made me think of newspeak, and
That's right.
who controls the past controls the present, and who controls the present controls the future.
Yeah.
So I also have a very quick minor question. When Kate and Moira were in the bathroom, just as they were parting, she looked down at Moira's hand and said, what did they do to you?
Yeah.
What was that?
I mean, this is unique to the film. I mean, it looked like I couldn't tell whether it was actually a prosthetic hand or just her hand had been tortured.
And that's why she was covered with a partial
With the lace or the gloves. Yeah, your point about George Orwell's 1984, clearly that is a heavy portent to Atwood's Gilead, and I think we have to assume she had it in mind. She's so full of literary references. I mean, I think it's very, very, I mean, the handmaids are not allowed to read or write, and it's a capital offense, which was that too is historically accurate. And not for women, but for enslaved Africans in the United States of America. So the fact that she plays Scrabble with the commander is hugely significant in the book and gets a lot of sort of the sensation of holding the counters and seeing the letters, and she actually is afraid she can't even play. So the language issue and its relationship to power is huge. Although we don't get the kind of Orwellian discussion of the mass media quite as much at all.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, in the book and the movie, the way like race goes on in the background with like the children of Ham. And
Yeah.
in the book, even the language of the Marthas, I think, sort of suggests that they might not be white, and also
Yeah.
in the way that it's just the terms of like white and black and not necessarily other races at all.
Yeah, I mean, sorry. I mean, those of you who've seen the Hulu series are aware that issue is completely marginalized. Like the Hulu series pretends that it's a kind of racially egalitarian world, and just somehow only women are oppressed, which is, I think, wrong. But certainly, I think that one very strong aspect of the film is its sort of slightly Nazi Germany-ish representation of people being sort of carted out of the center of Gilead. The kind of ecological point that Atwood makes that I think is harder to communicate is that Caucasian birth rates are dropping, and that this is a crisis in Gilead, which is explicitly constructed as a white supremacist theocracy, patriarchy, to put all those things together. So, and I think, so you're right, and Atwood has a slight, she mentions Asians a little bit, but not Asian Americans, and she doesn't discuss Latinos whatsoever. So it's the very slight reference to the children of Ham, and then, so it's a very kind of dualistic racial schema, no discussion of mixed race. So that I think is an aspect of the book that is, although Atwood clearly wants to say that patriarchy and racism go together, she doesn't fully flesh that out, I would say. And I think in some ways the film is fairly vivid at attempting to render that, but does also kind of overlook. So who the Marthas are, the book also has a kind of class dimension. There are these people called econo wives and econo husbands who are just poor people, and of course they're not represented at all anywhere else. And what their racial status there is unclear too. So I would say that some intersectional aspects are slightly underdeveloped. Yes?
You both spoke to complicity and kind of maybe the false dichotomy between resistance and acceptance of a regime like this.
Yeah.
And one thing that shocked me in the film, because I've seen the series, I read the book, when she killed the commander,
Yes.
I was like, whoa! And so I'm kind of wondering what you or what others think about how that might recast the narrative as like, okay, we should and can commit one murder, and all will be well, or that.
Right. I guess it's well for her in a way. She gets to be in the Airstream and have it all. I would love to hear what other people think, because obviously the murder of the commander is, I think the June is just so off the scale in terms of a sort of an invented heroic or semi-heroic ending. Other thoughts or comments about the, yes?
one hopes that if you really push too far, you can become active that way. But I was going to say about this not recalling things, when you've been isolated, subjugated, indoctrinated,
Yeah.
sometimes sublimation or forgetting helps you to survive under that. I lived through the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, so I think maybe my perspective might be a little different. There's also a difference if once you have power and you lose it, it's quite different than having not had power and doing something to finally achieve it. And there's a big difference there. So there are a lot of things going on here. Also, those costumes in the brothel remind me of decadent as the Weimar Republic was going down. Those costumes are very reminiscent of cabaret.
Yeah, right, yeah,
It
yeah.
was extremely decadent and very, very stripped down. So I think there are touches of a lot of echoes of the past.
Yeah.
And the
Separate
book of
wives, too.
Lysistrata, women have fought back in different ways in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I think one point that Atwood was making, which is critical and sort of different from the Lysistrata, is that women are divided against each other in this, and that's the most devious aspect of Gilead, right? Is that the wives and the handmaids and the Marthas and the Econo wives who don't really exist in it, but the women and of course the aunts who are the most terrifying and are sort of a little more brutal actually in the book. And they're carrying these sort of electric cattle prods, but they aren't allowed to have guns, but they can read. But that women are being sort of given a measure of power to subjugate each other. And so that's what's ultimately preventing them from acting as a class and sort of rising up. And my hope for the Hulu series, which I'm just sort of fantasizing about it and don't even care if it matches the book, my hope for the Hulu series is that Serena Joy will somehow connect to Fred and there'll be an insurrection. But, which I think would be more gratifying than just slitting one person's throat, right? Because, I mean, what's really, to me, a betrayal of the film is just that, okay, so she gets away. Like, that's a happy ending? So one person escapes? So it feels like a slight, like not a really feminist happy ending if one woman gets out.
Especially because she escapes and her baby escapes.
Right, exactly.
It's still the same thing.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's really ideological. Yes, I agree.
Can I just add to that comment I agree with that, where you're still like, and she's still pregnant, which is like that remake of Carrie, where you're like, oh, let's save her because she's mom, it's just, but I thought like one interesting point though is that like her biggest weapon at that point is the pregnancy itself, and she doesn't reveal it to him. I mean, she opts not to use that, which I thought was an interesting point.
Yeah.
Is that alliance with Selena Joy that you wish you could see, is that available in the Atwood text?
No, it doesn't happen in the Atwood text.
No, I mean, is it available?
Absolutely.
Does the Atwood text exclude the possibility?
The Atwood text. The Atwood text is extremely dark. I mean, although again, with the future, we see from centuries into the future that Gilead has fallen. And we don't know how. So what I would add is that this has only been 3 years of Gilead. So the sort of hope that Atwood does hold out, it has fallen somehow, maybe in 50 years in, but not the first generation like that.
Millennia.
It's gonna take a while.
Millennia.
Yes.
I'm kind of wondering about like the subplot with Nick the driver.
Yeah.
Like in this movie and in the Hulu series, it's almost like she can fall in love still with this guy and that whole thing. And I don't remember in the book, like, is she making that point, or is it more like, you can use somebody on the side?
Nick. I mean, she does actually. I had to go back and look. I mean, I did actually reread the book for the umpteenth times. I'm kind of obsessed with the book, but I had actually forgotten that when he summons her for that first time, and in the movie he just sort of grabs her and they lock in this Hollywood kiss, which is in the book they actually do kiss also, which is. But so Nick, I think it's far more refracted through June's. Who is kind of traumatized and alienated, right? So like it's sort of refracted across her subjectivity. So, and she's quite cynical about love. There's a paragraph where she says, "Oh, they just distracted us with falling in love, and you worked on a relationship, and if it was bad, you found another man." So she actually has a slightly cynical second wave take on love. So certainly you're not allowed to think she loves him, but she does enjoy having sex with him. So that, I think that is definitely a yes, that is there. Whether he's a member of the resistance is ultimately where the book ends, we don't know. Like, we actually don't know whether, I mean, clearly because the tapes are actually found in my hometown of Bangor, Maine, and there's a thing called the Underground Female Road. So these scholars imagine that we don't know whether she got to Canada or whether she just got to Maine and then was apprehended, the character. But presumably, if she made it even to Maine, Nick probably was in this May Day resistance. But I find the Nick subplot slightly weird. So yes.
In talking about second wave feminism, you mentioned pornography. Do you think pornography is inherently oppressive / anti-feminist?
Me personally?
Yes.
No. I don't, but I do teach the anti-porn ordinances that were written by McKinnon and Dworkin, or at least some of them. Like, they wrote a bunch of them, and like one actually passed in Indianapolis. Like, the various cities did adopt them. They were always struck down. Like, they never were put in. I mean, I have some sympathy with their position, probably more than most. I mean, they obviously are trying to legislate censorship. I understand that, and I would never endorse that. But I am sympathetic to the position that some pornography, obviously, can be violent and degrading. Yeah. But Atwood, I think, is a very hard line. Like, I mean, Atwood really wants to suggest that the kind of anti-porn feminism is really colluding, consciously or not, with the sort of religious right. So that comes through in the book. The character June, as a little girl, her mom is a second wave feminist, and she throws pornographic magazines into a bonfire, and that's clearly meant to sort of herald, to sort of play into the hands of this sort of weird puritanical regime.
Maybe we don't want to dwell too much on the pornography question, but it was always my understanding that Dworkin and McKinnon had a rather more narrow definition of pornography, and that which they were aiming to restrict. It wasn't just, Playboy probably wouldn't have fallen afoul.
Well, if you read the language, and it's of course incredibly hard to legislate, it says, any representation, I can't quote it verbatim, but basically any representation in which a man is degrading or harming a woman. So if you think about that, that could cast a pretty wide net. And it's certainly when you read it, when I discuss it with other people, the question really would then be, how would you apply that sort of, what is degradation, what is harm?
At least conceptually, wasn't there an effort? I mean, I never understood them to be saying, like, all representations of sex or sexuality, or naked women, for example, or even just objectification of women.
For Dworkin, yeah. Dworkin says having sex with a man is like being a Nazi colluder. But you can't have sex with a man at all. I mean, McKinnon has a son. I actually like Catherine McKinnon. She's amazing. She's doing amazing work on rape in Bosnia as a war crime. Like, she's a really important lawyer. So I'm not. She has a more measured take on it, I would say.
Also, don't you think in that scene it's interesting, speaking, about Dworkin and McKinnon, and then in the book, the mother who's burning porn magazines, is the scene where the commander shares his magazine stash, which is really interesting in the film that it's fashion magazines. I mean, I think you kind of see that one of them's a Playboy, but it really focuses on fashion magazines, which I thought in terms of what you spoke about Atwood's focus on, the idea of collusion in your participation in patriarchal culture. I thought it was interesting that she had the Vogue magazine, and what was the other one? Cosmo?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's subversive simply because women can't read. I mean, and what's sort of slightly pathetic and comic, I think, is that he thinks that's what she wants. Right? Like, all the things, like, they're in a library, he has shelves of books, and she's a librarian, and she's educated. Like, this is what he offers her. Right. Yeah, exactly. Like, after not reading for 3 years, you want to read Cosmo. But fair enough. I think Atwood, and there's a moment when Fred or June sees the cover of Vogue, and she just perceives it, and she's actually sort of, again, it's this moment like the bunny moment I read, where she's sort of startled by how bold the woman. I mean, she's constantly having these kind of existential moments of seeing like a tourist woman in makeup or the image of the cover of Vogue and actually being shocked by it. And so the suggestion being, again, that in 3 years you would be sort of you would have adapted to this new reality. And I'll ask students about it, and most students are like, oh, that's impossible. But then a student who's come here from the Middle East or who has come from a place where she's dressed differently will actually say no. Like 3 years, it really doesn't take that long to adjust to a sort of radically different social structure if it's really immersive. Like, so, I mean, probably most of us haven't done that, but yeah.
I was just wondering if in the book they give any clue as to what happens to the kids? Like, are they brought into handmaidenry, or?
They're taken by the commander's wives. I mean, that's a good question of who will replace the handmaids. Yeah, that's a very good question.
And in the little series, they have those little girls dressed in pink that you kind of think it's like a little line, and maybe they're like
Right, poor girls. Yeah, I mean, in technology, reproductive technology has been banned by the regime. So that's why, if you're wondering why not just clone people, or they're not allowed to do that. You can't have, no prenatal diagnostics of any kind. So you have to bring it to term, no matter what it is. I mean, it's always a fascinating question, the sort of specific details of any regime that's in, like, how does it really work? So yeah, it's a good question. Yes?
So I'm a social psychologist, and so I really like all the, could this really happen? So what I thought was interesting in the book was, like, the tipping point was the fertility rates plummeting. And so, not being a historian, is there some historical significance with that? Because I sort of see, nowadays, that doesn't seem to be the tipping point.
Yeah.
We're moving that direction regardless. We just sort of speculate, or?
Yeah, and I'll hand it to Mary too so she can speculate. Yeah, I mean, that is much of the representation of the 80s and before is realistic. But the one thing that is not, at least as far as I know, is that Caucasian birth rates are plummeting really rapidly. And that's actually what sparks this clampdown and sort of use of these women. And I don't think that's really happening. But I think that the racial part, like the fact that it's responding to a need to sort of segregate the sort of reproduction, is a piece of it, a kind of racial paranoia that is also something clearly that's not imminent, but that is something to ponder.
Yeah, I guess my only addition to the ponder is, because you mentioned a little bit about Atwood invoking real historical events, but I mean, it wasn't a drop in birth rates due to biological reasons or ecological disaster, but in Germany during the rise of Hitler in the Second World War, there was a decrease in birth rates due to women actually going to college and joining the workforce. One law in Germany at the time for native German women who were meant to, at that point, reproduce the Aryan race, and that was their most important function, were banned from the professions and from college. And so then there was a surge in the birth rate at the beginning of the war. So I thought, I think that it's part of what she invokes. And then, of course, all of the connections she makes between, you mentioned intersexuality. I mean, like the ecological disaster and mistreatment and abuse of natural resources in the earth and that sort of thing, I think she ties, together in the very beginning.
Yeah, Mary's raised a very important point. The relationship between kind of patriarchal power and women's, obviously, their ability to control their fertility. And I do think that the defunding of Planned Parenthood, the sort of rabid anti-abortion legislation that's occurring now in this country, clearly, whether transparently or not, is acting to, particularly for women with fewer means, to radically limit their choices in terms of any professional or sort of class mobility. Yes.
It's Handmaid tells the other ones, we may have to ask you to kill him. Who was she representing? Who's we?
I think the resistance, this May Day resistance. That too is a sort of so the resistance is represented as a little bit more communicative and together in the film. You.
At the birthing party,
right.
there were children there, but they were all little girls. Where were the little boys?
Yeah. There were no male
That's
children.
a great point.
There were no male children that were taken.
Right, so the kids are segregated, yeah. Right.
Or it might have been a genetic
Right. Yeah. It's a fascinating, just sort of fascinating and amusing, because one second wave insight, of course, is that you don't need men at all, right, to reproduce. Like, just get some sperm. And that, that was, many feminist utopias were all woman utopias, and that, in some, the irony there is maybe we just flip this around. And, but I don't think that's what the movie is suggesting. I guess that boys are just somehow being indoctrinated separately.
Elsewhere.
Elsewhere. I mean, presumably you wouldn't want children to form sympathetic connections with the class of children they're going to dominate. Yeah.
So girls are segregated then?
Probably. Yes.
I wanted to ask a question, what you feel about, and this is film-based, because I have not had the opportunity to read the novel. The commander seems to be subordinate to his wife. And his wife's domestic wishes take priority, that's why he sends the handmaiden away. Do you think this is a Harold Pinter conceit, or do you think that this is something that's extracted from the novel and therefore is true to the original?
Well, it's definitely not taken from the novel. And Pinter, I would just add as a little fun fact, like Pinter, some of you may know this, refused, was really annoyed that he gets this credit because he claimed that he did all this work. This was an incredibly vexed production. They couldn't get money. They couldn't get a studio to back it. They were going to have Sigourney Weaver play Alfred. By the time they were ready to film it, she was, ironically enough, pregnant, so couldn't do it. But so Pinter claimed that his work had been sort of messed up by many other hands, so really hard to say. I think that maybe the sense is that the Robert Duvall character seems kind of cuddly on the surface, or a little bit like he's, slightly amenable to his wife's desires, but really he's not. But he has all the power.
And he's just a big coward at the end, right? When he's like, oh, well, my wife, I can't, sorry, I'd like to help you out, but my wife, I just thought as a way of being a complete coward and not extending himself to help her in any way. So I just thought it was interesting, yeah. And then was there someone, right here, who had a question?
My question's more focused on religion. So a lot of it is under his eye, and it's focusing a lot. They don't say Christianity, but they're reading from the Old Testament, and it seems that no other religion is mentioned, and it's so fiercely done for religious reasons or under the guise of religious reasons. But then at the same time, it seems totally absent in other parts of the book and of the movie. And I just find I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how she's able to make it so prominent and yet so not prominent at the same time.
No, that's a great question. Clearly the book, and the film is fairly faithful to the book in this regard. The moment when of Fred is talking of Glenn in front of that bizarre shop window, and it's a little hard to read what that is. And that's actually, Atwood is actually a really great satirist, which really does not come through very well in what's basically a horror movie. But that's a sort of weirdly, it's a mechanical prayer-producing machine, and people can go and give it money, and it'll sort of just spill out prayers for you on a kind of endless loop of paper. So I do think that Atwood is pretty, sees Christian theology to the extent that it's being used, which is this one small bit of Genesis, as just completely hollow, just completely being deployed to cover patriarchy. My sense is that she's not intimating that these characters really have devout religious feelings. What's interesting, I think an interesting question for us to think about, and Mike Pence comes to mind, and he would be the strongest portent, but just to what extent, again, thinking about to what extent can we think about consistencies in our present tense. And it's easy to look at Jezebel, the scene in the brothel, and like, okay, this is recognizably women being exploited, and we see that in the present tense, and you know, the music is playing the Fine Young Cannibals, it's like very, definitely the mid-80s, that moment, but I do think that the religious piece, that's where Atwood is invested in having us think, like how is religion being deployed to political ends, like that is, I think, her investment.
Yeah, and I thought it was just interesting, if you're reading it as portraying Christianity alone, that, of course, the entire New Testament is lopped off. You know, the whole softer side of Christianity is left out, and so they just, again, it's like picking and choosing what fits your political means. So I thought that was a really, also an interesting point. But I wanted to ask Helen a question too. Was so the scene at Jezebel's, I thought what was amazing there too is the scene where Duval's, or the commander says, oh, and she used to be a lawyer, and she was a businesswoman, and there's that scene where I think that, I'd have to go back and see how the scene, read the scene in the book again, but if it is true to Atwood, just the way in which she completely, the film, he completely divorces a woman's professional aspirations from her sexual desire. And I thought that was really interesting in terms of the Scrabble scene, where what really turns him on is the fact that she's smart, you know? And so I just thought that was an amazing scene, and for some reason it just reminded me of that Lizzie Borden Working Girls in the way, where, remember the scene, I don't know if you remember, which is sort of sexuality, or sex and the economy, but there's a scene where she is sleeping with this old man who's her John, who in real life was her film professor at NYU. Where he's like, oh, well, basically he's like, I went to Yale. And then she says, oh, I went to Harvard. And then he's like, I know. Like that's why I chose you. So like, I just thought that was a really amazing part.
Yeah, no, I don't know what I can add to that. That's an amazing, I mean, certainly, clearly he enjoys, there's a sort of pleasure in subjugating women and sort of having, dominating them, knowing that they were in these relatively socially elevated positions. The Scrabble game is interesting. I mean, and Atwood really, I mean, it's clear that the commander is kind of a serial womanizer, to the extent that sleeping with your handmaid is womanizing. I guess literally it is, but he's done this with the prior handmaid who hangs herself. And that's much more fleshed out. So clearly he has some sort of kink, there's some factor for him in particularly in bringing out the Scrabble board and exposing these women to language. And I would just add that particular, we are told, his name is Fred Waterford. We are told in the Gileadian Studies Symposium in 2195 that he's purged. So he doesn't make it very far in the regime, and I think that this is symptomatic. Like clearly he isn't enough of a hardliner. Like he's getting off on playing Scrabble with a woman, you know, with watching these handmaids getting to play Scrabble. So, and that too is too problematic for the regime. So.
There's somebody.
She's been waiting a long time.
I'm sorry, I can't see.
She's been waiting a very long time.
Whoever's waiting a long time, please ask the question. I'm sorry, no, I just
Just me. I just wanted to make a comment that the Hulu production is so different from this film.
Yeah.
Because this film is very, for one thing, it moves very fast, and Hulu's is very slow. There's a lot of silence, there's not a lot of dialogue, but it feels very intense, very dramatic, and this is almost funny. I mean, it's comical.
It is funny.
And it's just so different. I was just so amazed at that. They're so different productions.
Yeah, I mean, there clearly is the difference of 10 hours versus, an hour and a half, 90 minutes. So this is so radically condensed. And he does seem to want to shoot it a little bit as a thriller, and is clearly heightening those elements. I mean, this was a flop, those of you who don't. I mean, I think it cost about $9 million and it made about $4.9 million. And it was men hated it. It was robustly panned by male reviewers. And Janet Maslin, like a few women were more sympathetic to it the men were just like rabid, very upset by it. But yeah, I would say that the Hulu is attempting, and I think the person who's producing the Hulu series is a very avowed fan of the book, is attempting to kind of constitute an interior dialogue or monologue. I think the series is still making her too resistant and is not engaging these issues of sort of coerced forgetting and just sort of disorientation. But certainly trying very hard to restore the kind of subjective point of view that is lost in the movie.
Who else had a...
To bring it to the current day, I know that the movie, I haven't read the book yet, but it does make me think mostly about the Holocaust. That's what I kept thinking about, like, oh wow, this really can't happen. It's just happening to women in this The Handmaid's Tale. But also bringing it to the present day, which you brought up, there are things happening today that I didn't think would ever happen again. You know, I grew up in what, the 70s with I Dream a Genie and Bewitched, and I love those shows, but you couldn't get away with them now, and I think that's a good thing. Then I went and I got my education and I had more opportunities available to me now. But with what happened this last year, it scares me. So I think that it's a good time for Hulu to have released the series, and I do think it makes you think about contemporary issues, and not to get political, but you know, Trump. And then if something did happen to him, then we'd have Pence and Ryan and their positions. You know, he won't even, he says he won't have lunch with the woman. Well, or they have to sometimes have lunch to do business. I mean, Pence isn't talking about grabbing people by the pussy, but he is talking about how he just has lunch and dinner with his wife. And so he sits with a group of men who make all the decisions. So
I mean, I find it just as insulting and crazy to refuse to eat a meal with a woman. Yes. I mean, what's the problem? I mean, are women so carnally distracted to him?
Yes, they are.
Yeah. So no, I mean, yes, I mean, I think that amazingly the Hulu series was in production obviously before the election, so it's sort of an incredible historical coincidence, and clearly, yeah, not everyone was anticipating this outcome. It would have felt really different had it gone the other way.
There's one more person back here.
I haven't read The Handmaid's Tale in so many years. But what you guys just said about eating, I remember there was a whole lot about women's control over eating in the book, but I don't remember specifically, since you've read it more recently, I mean, there was a big deal about that, and the only parts I think you saw here was when they refused to take their pills, right? But I think there was a lot.
I mean, the main thing is that, actually, which is replicated, interestingly, is that she's forced to eat this incredibly bland, quote-unquote wholesome diet, you know, like the glass of milk, the sandwich, the breakfast with the egg. So she's on this sort of, I guess it's a pro-fertility diet, although, but so that's the main food thematic that in the book. But it is a big one because she has no control. She really has no control over any of her bodily functions. So, including eating. So that is an important aspect.
Let's take two more. This woman in the back, and then this man right here, and then we'll raise it up.
On the continuity part, one thing that kind of struck me in the movie was sort of the class differences between which kinds of women got to do which things. So you had the wives who had nicer clothes. At least Serena Joy seemed to have been a celebrity of some kind. There was that, and then the handmaidens, presumably, like, the point was that they just happened to be fertile, but all of the fertile ones also happened to be pretty skinny, which sort of was odd. And then the Marthas were all kind of more matronly, an elderly and I guess clearly not of childbearing age, which I thought was an interesting thing. And then it kind of made me think, as we were talking about continuity, the 53% of white women who, after having watched this video of Trump getting off the bus, after having talking about grabbing a woman by the pussy and then like hugging the woman, still voted for him. And just sort of that. Oh, and sorry, there was a comment by Serena Joy at one point about men not being able to get divorces, and she said, I think it was something like, we made sure to put that in. So they had, I guess, some kind of illusion of getting something that sort of, I guess, played into them building a sort of thing where it's like, well, I will be as minimally oppressed as possible by increasing the oppression on other women and just kind of shifting that somewhere else. And kind of the sort of echoes of that in the last election of whatever, I don't know, whiteness or whatever it was that caused so many women to vote in what I would describe as against their interest, but you know, whatever.
Yeah, maybe you could relate it to that new Mad Max and how all the mothers look like they weigh 96 pounds.
Right. I mean, my impulse there, at least in terms of how the handmaids are, they also are all blonde with like, and their hair is sort of beautifully coiffed, even in the house, and you're like, well, but you don't have a curling irons, that would be a weapon. It's like, how are you doing this? And I would blame the director. I mean, I do, because if you watch the Hulu series, which I will say, like, it goes to greater lengths to have a sort of diversity of body types, and that no woman wears makeup ever, which of course they're not wearing makeup. But in the film, she's wearing makeup, she's constantly in makeup. Like, I don't think there's ever a scene where she's not wearing makeup. So I think that even, the irony to me is that the film, the visual idiom of the film is sort of sexualizing, even at the moment it's supposed to be representing this kind of sort of radically sort of puritanical religious regime. It's like the director couldn't resist putting her, you know, curling her hair. So that I would say is, that aspect of the representation is I would blame the male director. But yeah, I would say that the Serena Joy character, who gets a little more backstory in the book, she gets no internal life because it's all through the eyes of June, but she's a televangelist. So she's kind of a Tammy Faye Baker character, like her mascara runs and she gets all head up and cries thinking about how great it is that women have to reproduce. And so yes, it's a huge commentary on the kind of right-wing, white, anti-feminist backlash, which of course is still with us. And to go back to the comment before yours about Trump, I mean, I do think that Pence is sort of the specter, to me, that this film raises, and the book raise with maybe even more force, like this evangelical vision of a kind of reproductive mandate that is tied to the health of the nation and that has to be enforced by any means necessary. But absolutely, I think that Atwood is talking directly to upper class white women who are not, who are in her mind siding with the patriarchy.
I'll just add just about the aesthetics of the film, because also when you read the passage about Moira's outfit from the book, because I would say that the outfit fit her just right in the film. You know, it's definitely not, there's nothing, I mean, she just looked like she walked out of a laundry catalog. So it's definitely very differently represented the women, the way they look than in the book. So who, right here, sir?
I was going to say that reminds me of my growing up in Argentina, where a military man was killed by a woman, actually infiltrating his home and becoming friends and killing him. But also the placing of the kids of murdered women were placed in the families of the military. And so, I don't know, all these movies have brought bad feelings and bad memories. And I was wondering how are we evolving? Is we humans will never get out of this brutality that we repeat over and over again, or we making progress? I don't see it, but I am asking that question to you.
I'll speak to the first part first, and then we can. I mean, the question of the children is crucial because June is at the cusp of remembering. but she's the last generation of handmaids or who remembers and has it in her to sort of, you know, she's educated and she has lived under the old regime. And her lost child, it's significant that it's a girl and not a boy. And her great fear, I mean, and she thinks about this, is this that her daughter has been passed off to this other family and is going to will not remember anything, right? So will just be raised to be what they want her to be. So there is this very, very vivid specter of like the total erasure of any sort of, any memory, any language. So that, I think that is the sort of movement of children into families that will indoctrinate them is, for Atwood, I think, a really critical piece of any sort of repressive regime. And I'm sure she's thinking about Argentina when, you know, I'm sure that was on her mind. The second half, you know, I think that the book is really, June is not a heroic character. And unlike the film where we have this kind of act of crazy hero, if we want to call it heroism at the end, where she slits the commander's throat. But I think the message of the book really is about solidarity, like that change or resistance can only happen across a coalition of people, and that one person can't be expected to just buck the system and sort of be Wonder Woman or whatever. So that, I think, is the only hope that's being held out in Atwood's book.
Yeah, I would just add too that I think it really supports the points that you open with about the extent to which we accept or normalize or naturalize. I mean, because you could, of course there's still, we have an amazing film that we have for rent here called Ixcanul, which also deals with Native children being kidnapped in Guatemala, which is something that's still going on today. But I mean, it's also, but there are these other sort of less foreign to us things that I do think we overlook and normalize. For example, the fact that nannies or domestic workers are paid such a low wage that they spend all day looking after white babies and not with their own children. But when we see a woman of color pushing a white kid in a stroller, we you don't really question it. So I mean, I do think that the question and that really supports the point you made, that there has to be a constant questioning of what we consider normal or natural or what we accept.
In the book, though, it does come from the future, and it does say that the regime has fallen.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there would be a different perspective on it if we didn't have that hope. Like, in the movie, you don't have that hope. You don't really know if it's going to fall or not. So I think in that way, like, it allows you to, you know, be like, okay, things are bad. They're really, really bad. And as bad as they can be, it can change.
Yeah, well, it ends in an interesting way. Like the symposium, it's definitely no longer, and people have very interesting last names that would indicate a kind of ethnic and racial diversity, that this is no longer a stratified society in the same way, and that it's kind of globally diverse. It does end, they're kind of joking about Gilead, and they finally say, well, let's not judge too harshly, you know, we can't condemn, we weren't there. So this real appeal to kind of cultural relativism, and I think Atwood is cautioning against that. So it's a positive ending insofar as the regime has dissolved somewhere, but I think it's also a cautionary ending, like, we should speak out. Like, if you think, oh, it's culturally improper to condemn something that seems oppressive. I mean, Atwood is trying to suggest that no, you know, really horrible things are being done to women every day in our world. So I think that, yes, it is not, Gilead is gone in the book, but I think that she is still ending on a pretty cautionary note.
Helen, let's give it up for Helen. I thought that was a completely awesome discussion, so thanks everybody, and I hope to see you at the next teach-in. And don't forget, we have awesome movies every night of the week here at FACETS, so you don't even have to wait for a teach-in.